The airlock door hissed open, and the cold air of the vantage spire hit my face like a warning. I had 30 seconds to walk into that training hall before the doors sealed behind me for good. I took a breath and stepped through. My name is Lena Cole, and I was about to become the only human ever accepted into the Confederacy's elite recruit program. The hall went silent the moment I entered. Rows of alien recruits turned to look at me, and I felt every pair of eyes measuring me, weighing me, and finding me small. A Krail warrior near the front bared a row of curved teeth and laughed, a deep rasping sound that echoed off the metal walls. Beside him, a cluster of Osun recruits tilted their heads in unison, their pale eyes blinking at the same exact moment, as if one mind controlled a dozen bodies. Near the back, a tall, graceful Faith recruit watched me without expression, arms folded, waiting to see what I would do. I did not look away. I walked to the center of the hall and stopped where a black line was painted on the floor, the mark every new recruit had to stand on for inspection. A voice cut through the room before I could speak. "You are late by 4 seconds." I turned toward the sound and found the trainer standing on a raised platform above us. His name was Draeth Vorn Kesh, and I had read about him before I ever set foot on this station. He belonged to a species called the Severin, apex predators from a world so hostile that only the strongest of their kind survived past childhood. Even standing still, he looked like something built for hunting. His eyes were a deep amber, sharp and unblinking, and his presence made the air in the room feel heavier. 4 seconds, he said again, stepping down from the platform and walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. In a real battle, 4 seconds is the difference between victory and death. "Then I'll be faster next time," I said. A few recruits chuckled. The Krail warrior from earlier crossed his arms and smirked. "Next time," as if there will be a next time for this one. Draeth did not smile. He circled me once, studying me the way a predator studies something it has never seen before. "Humans," he said, almost to himself. "Soft skin, no claws, no venom, no natural armor, slow reflexes compared to every species in this room." He stopped in front of me. "Tell me, Recruit Cole, why the Confederacy allowed you into this program." "Because I earned it," I said. "You earned a seat," he said. "You have not earned respect. That is different." He turned to address the entire hall, his voice carrying easily across the silence. "This recruit will be placed in the lowest squad, Squad 7, for her own safety." Laughter rippled through the room again, louder this time. I kept my face still, but inside, something tightened. I had heard those words my whole life, in different forms, from different people. Too fragile, too slow, not built for this. I had heard it from instructors back on Earth, from officials who did not want to send a human candidate into a program built for species, with claws and armor, and centuries of war behind them. I had heard it, and I had come anyway. Squad 7 turned out to be exactly what everyone expected, the recruits nobody else wanted. A Krail named Torin, quick-tempered and proud, who saw every conversation as a fight he was destined to win. An Osun called Vex, who barely spoke because Osun communicated best through their hive link and struggled alone. A Faith named Isolde, elegant and cold, who watched everything and revealed nothing. And me. Nobody welcomed me. Nobody explained the training schedule, or where to find equipment, or how the simulation pods worked. I learned by watching, by asking questions that were sometimes ignored, and by making mistakes in front of an audience that enjoyed watching me fail. On my first day of physical evaluation, they placed me against Torin in a wrestling drill. He was nearly twice my size, with plated skin and claws that could tear through training mats. The instructor blew the starting signal, and Torin charged. I did not try to match his strength. I had none to match. Instead, I stepped aside at the last possible moment, letting his own momentum carry him past me and into the padded wall. The recruits watching went quiet for half a second before the laughter returned, this time aimed at Torin instead of me. He got up slowly, his pride wounded more than his body. "Lucky," he growled. "Maybe," I said. "Let's find out." We went 3 more rounds. He won 2 through raw strength, pinning me hard enough that the mat left marks on my arms. But I won 1, using his own weight against him again, and by the end of the session, something in his expression had shifted from contempt to something closer to curiosity. It was not respect. Not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. That night, alone in my small quarters, I studied everything I could find about the other species in my squad. Krail were driven by pride and strength, and they respected anyone who could stand up to them without breaking. Osun thought in patterns and probabilities, most comfortable when they could predict an outcome. Faith valued precision and control above almost everything else, and they distrusted anything unpredictable. I realized something that night that would carry me through every trial ahead. I could not outmuscle a Krail. I could not outcompute an Osun. I could not outcontrol a Faith. But I could adapt faster than any of them, because unlike them, I had spent my whole life being underestimated, and I had learned to turn that into an advantage instead of a wound. The days that followed were not easy. Someone tampered with my gear before a climbing exercise, loosening a strap just enough to make the climb dangerous. I noticed it in time, tightened it myself, and said nothing, though I saw the disappointment on a few faces when I reached the top without falling. During a strategy exercise, my proposed plan was mocked openly by an Osun officer who called it primitive before the simulation even began. I let the results speak instead of arguing, and when my supposedly primitive plan succeeded where the more complex ones failed, the mockery quieted, at least for a while. Dreyth watched all of this from a distance. He rarely spoke to me directly, but I began to notice him in the observation gallery more often than seemed necessary for a trainer overseeing the lowest-ranked squad. He would stand with his arms behind his back, utterly still, watching me the way he might watch an unfamiliar animal, trying to decide what category I belonged in. One evening, after a grueling obstacle course that left my legs shaking and my lungs burning, I overheard 2 recruits from another squad talking near the equipment lockers. They did not know I was close enough to hear. "She will not last another week," one of them said. "Dreyth only put her in Squad 7 so she would wash out quietly, without embarrassing the program." "He is probably right," the other replied. "Humans do not belong in the Confederacy military. They belong on their home world, growing food and building small ships." I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting against the cold metal of a locker, feeling the old, familiar sting of being dismissed before I had even finished proving myself. Then I thought of my grandmother, who used to say that the loudest doubts often came from people who were afraid of being wrong. I straightened my shoulders, walked past the 2 recruits without a word, and let them see that I had heard everything and it had not broken me. Squad 7's next major test came only 2 days later, and it would be the first moment the entire station would be forced to see me differently. It was a live simulation exercise, designed to test how recruits handled sudden crisis and unexpected failure. Nobody, not even Torin with all his confidence, expected what was about to happen inside that simulation chamber, or how it would change the way an apex predator like Dreyth Vornkesh looked at the smallest, softest recruit on the entire station. The simulation room stood at the far end of the training deck, a massive chamber built to recreate any battlefield the Confederacy could imagine. As Squad 7 walked toward it, I could feel the tension building among my squadmates. Torin rolled his shoulders, cracking the plates along his arms. Vex stayed close to the wall, murmuring softly to himself, in a language I did not understand, perhaps trying to reach the comfort of his hive mind, even though the connection here was weak. Isolde said nothing at all, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her posture perfect as always. Dreyth stood waiting at the entrance, his amber eyes sweeping over each of us in turn. When his gaze reached me, he held it a moment longer than necessary before speaking. "Today's exercise will test your ability to function when a plan collapses," he said. "Most recruits fail, not because they lack skill, but because they lack the will to keep moving when everything goes wrong. Enter." The doors slid open, and we stepped into what looked like the ruins of an abandoned outpost, complete with shifting light, artificial dust, and the distant sound of simulated conflict. The scenario began simply enough. We were to secure a supply cache and retreat before a simulated enemy force arrived. Torin wanted to charge straight through the center, trusting his strength to clear any obstacle. Isolde argued for a slow, calculated approach that would take too long given the time limit. Vex kept recalculating probabilities out loud, unable to commit to either plan without more data than we had. I suggested a middle path, splitting our approach to move quickly while staying covered, using the terrain instead of fighting against it. Nobody agreed immediately, but with the clock counting down, Torin finally growled his agreement, and the others followed. The plan worked, right up until the simulation threw its true challenge at us. A structural collapse, unscheduled and violent within the simulation, dropped a section of the ruined building directly onto Torin, pinning him beneath simulated debris that the system registered as a serious injury. His comm crackled with static as the simulation locked his character into an incapacitated state, unable to move or fight back. Isolde's voice came through sharp and controlled. "Leave him. The mission parameters do not require full squad survival. We can still complete the objective and extract." "No," I said. "He is a liability now," she replied. "Sentiment will not help him or the mission." I was already moving before she finished speaking, cutting across the debris field toward Torin's position while the simulated countdown ticked louder in my ear. Vex called out a probability, something about the odds of successful extraction dropping below acceptable thresholds if I diverted from the plan. I ignored the numbers and kept moving. Torin stared up at me through the settling dust, his expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "Go," he said. "Complete the mission." "The mission includes you," I said, already working to clear the debris pinning him down. It was heavier than I expected, even within a simulation designed to feel real, and my arms burned with the effort. Isolde's voice crackled again in my ear, colder now, warning that time was running out. I did not answer her. I focused on Torin, on the weight beneath my hands, on the seconds slipping away. Finally, with one last effort, I shifted the largest piece of debris enough for him to pull himself free. He staggered upright, favoring one side where the simulation had registered damage, but standing. "Move," I said, and we ran together toward the extraction point, Vex and Isolde already ahead of us, the simulated threat closing in from behind. We made it through the extraction doors with only seconds remaining on the clock, the simulation's alarms cutting off abruptly as the exercise ended. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Torin turned to look at me, his expression unreadable beneath the plated ridges of his face. "You risked the mission for me," he said slowly, as if trying to understand a language he had never heard before. "Why?" "Because leaving you behind was never an option," I said, still catching my breath. Isolde studied me with something new in her eyes, no longer simple coldness, but a kind of careful reassessment. "That decision was inefficient," she said, "and yet it worked." Vex, quiet as always, simply looked at me for a long moment before returning to his murmuring, though this time it sounded less like anxious calculation and more like something thoughtful. I did not know it then, but high above the simulation chamber, in the observation gallery reserved for instructors, Draith Vorn Kesh had watched the entire exercise without once looking away. He had seen thousands of recruits pass through that chamber over the years, had watched countless squads make the calculated, logical choice to leave a wounded member behind when the mission demanded it. It was, by every standard his people understood, the correct choice. Strength survived, weakness was left behind. That was the order of things on a world like his, and in a confederacy built largely around that same cold arithmetic. What he had just witnessed did not fit that arithmetic at all. He remained in the gallery long after the simulation ended and the recruits had filed out, his amber eyes fixed on the empty chamber below, turning over what he had seen. A creature with no claws, no armor, no natural advantage of any kind, had chosen to risk failure and danger for the sake of another, not because logic demanded it, but because something inside her refused to consider any other option. It was not weakness. He was beginning to suspect it might be something his own people, for all their strength, had never fully understood. For the first time since I arrived on the Vantage Spire, Draith found himself recalculating everything he thought he knew about the small, soft, unarmored recruit he had assigned to the squad, meant to fail quietly, out of sight, out of mind. He did not yet know it, but the true test of that recalculation was still ahead of us, waiting on a hostile world where his own people hunted for sport, and where I would face something far more dangerous than any simulation could recreate. Word of what had happened in the simulation chamber spread through the station faster than I expected. By the next morning, recruits who had never spoken to me before were watching me in the hallways with expressions I did not quite recognize, somewhere between curiosity and grudging respect. Torin, in particular, seemed changed. He no longer challenged me during training with the same edge of contempt. Instead, he began asking questions, quiet ones, about how I had known the debris would shift the way it did, about why I had chosen to risk failure for his sake, when every instinct his species carried would have told him to do the opposite in my place. Where I come from, I told him one evening as we cleaned equipment after a long day of drills, we have a saying, no one gets left behind. It is not always the smart choice. It is not always the safe choice, but it is the choice that makes us who we are. Torin considered this in silence for a long moment, turning a piece of equipment over in his clawed hands. Among my people, he said slowly, the weak are left behind so the strong may continue. It has always been this way. I did not expect to owe my continued existence to the weakest member of my squad. I'm not weak, I said, without anger, simply stating a fact I had come to understand about myself. I'm just built differently than you. He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Perhaps, he said finally, different is not the same as weak. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me. Isolde too began treating me differently, though her change was quieter, more internal. She started including me in strategic discussions she once would have handled alone, testing my instincts against her calculations, sometimes disagreeing sharply, but always listening. Even Vex, still struggling with the isolation of being cut off from his hive, began sitting closer to me during meals, as if my steady presence offered something his own kind could not provide in that moment. Squad 7, the squad built from rejects and afterthoughts, was slowly becoming something else. Not through strength, and not through perfect strategy, but through a kind of stubborn loyalty that none of them had encountered before, and that I had never fully understood I possessed until I was tested by circumstances that demanded it. But not everyone on the station was pleased by this change. There were other recruits, from squads built on pure strength and pedigree, who saw Squad 7's rising reputation as an insult. Among them was a Krail commander in training named Ryza, cold and ambitious, who had made it clear from my first day that she considered my presence in the program an embarrassment to everything the Confederacy stood for. You should not be here, she told me directly one afternoon, cornering me near the training deck's equipment bay. This program exists to prepare the strongest of the Confederacy for real conflict, real danger, not to give soft, fragile species the illusion of belonging. I've earned my place here, I said evenly, same as you. You have earned nothing, she snapped. You have been given special treatment because the Confederacy wants to appear generous toward weaker species. When real danger arrives, you will see exactly how much that generosity is worth. I did not respond to her anger with anger of my own. I simply held her gaze until she finally turned and walked away, though her words lingered with me longer than I wanted to admit. Somewhere deep down, beneath the calm exterior I had trained myself to show, a small, familiar doubt still whispered that maybe she was right, that maybe I truly did not belong among species built by evolution and centuries of conflict for exactly this kind of life. I pushed the doubt aside the only way I knew how, by working harder, training longer, and refusing to give anyone, including myself, a reason to believe I did not belong. Draith called me to his private training chamber the following week, an unusual request that immediately drew curious glances from the rest of Squad 7. I walked in to find him standing before a wall of star charts, studying something I could not quite make out from the doorway. "You wish to see me," I said. He turned slowly, his amber eyes studying me with an intensity that made me want to stand straighter, though I resisted the urge, refusing to show him anything but calm confidence. "Squad 7 has been selected for a live field trial," he said. "A trial conducted on Cauldron, a world used by my own people for hunting exercises." I had heard of Cauldron, whispered about among recruits as one of the most dangerous testing grounds in the entire Confederacy training program, a wild world where predator species from Draith's own homeworld were sometimes released to test the survival instincts of recruits under conditions no simulation could fully recreate. "Squad 7 has never faced anything like this," I said carefully. "No squad ever has, until they do," Draith replied. "This trial will determine whether your squad, and you specifically, truly belong in this program, or whether the doubts surrounding your presence here are justified." I understood immediately what he was not saying directly. This was not simply a training exercise. It was a test designed to answer a question that had been building since the moment I stepped off that airlock and onto this station, a question that every recruit, every officer, and perhaps even Draith himself was waiting to have answered. Did I truly belong here, or had the Confederacy made a mistake in allowing a human into a program built for creatures far more suited to war than I could ever claim to be? "When do we leave?" I asked. 3 days, Draith said. "Prepare your squad, and prepare yourself, Recruit Cole. Cauldron does not care about determination. It only respects survival, Tab." I left that chamber with a weight settled firmly in my chest, heavier than anything I had carried since arriving on the Vantage Spire. Somewhere out among the stars waited a world built for hunting, and soon Squad 7 and I would step onto its surface, facing a trial that would either prove every doubter wrong or confirm every fear that had followed me since the day I first dreamed of standing among the stars. I did not yet know that on Cauldron I would come face to face with the very species Draith belonged to, hunting not for training, but for something far older and far more dangerous, a tradition that had existed among the Severin long before the Confederacy ever formed. I did not know that survival there would demand something from me that no simulation, no training drill, and no amount of preparation could ever fully ready me for. But I would learn soon enough, standing alone in the dark, with nothing but my own refusal to break standing between myself and a predator that had never once, in all its long life, encountered anything like me before. The transport ship dropped through Cauldron's atmosphere with a shudder that rattled through my bones, and through the small viewport beside my seat, I caught my first glimpse of the world that would decide everything. Endless forests stretched beneath us, dark green and dense, broken by jagged ridges of black stone and rivers that caught the light of a pale orange sun. It looked almost peaceful from above. I knew better than to trust that impression. Squad 7 sat together near the rear of the transport, quiet in a way that felt different from the awkward silence of our first days together. Torin checked his gear for the 3rd time, his claws tapping against the straps in a steady rhythm. Isolde sat perfectly still, eyes closed, running through strategies in her mind. Vex murmured softly, reaching for whatever thin connection remained to his hive, drawing what comfort he could from it before we landed somewhere that connection might not reach at all. I checked my own equipment, a standard field pack, a short-range communicator, a blade meant more for cutting brush than combat, and a suit designed to regulate my body temperature against Cauldron's unpredictable climate. Compared to my squad mates, my gear looked almost laughably simple. No claws, no natural camouflage, no venom glands or reinforced hide, just tools, and whatever I carried inside my own mind. Draith's voice came through the transport's comm system, calm and steady despite the descent. "The objective is simple. Reach the marked extraction point, 12 kilometers from your landing zone, within 48 hours. Avoid unnecessary conflict. Survive. And if we encounter hostile wildlife? Isolde asked. You will, Draeth replied simply, and offered nothing further. The transport landed in a small clearing, engines powering down as the rear hatch opened onto humid air, thick with unfamiliar scents. We stepped out into the forest, sunlight filtering green and gold through a canopy far above us, the ground soft with fallen leaves and moss. For a moment, despite everything, the beauty of the place struck me. Then Torin's low growl pulled my attention back to the mission at hand. We move quickly, he said. Waste no time. We fell into a formation we had practiced during training, Torin taking point with his strength and instincts, Isolde close behind, managing our direction and pace, Vex handling communication and tracking any signals we might pick up, and me covering our rear, watching for anything that approached from behind. It was not a formation built around my strengths specifically, but it made use of what I could offer, and by now, my squad trusted me enough to place me there without hesitation. The first several hours passed without major incident, though the forest tested us in smaller ways. Vex identified a plant whose spores caused disorientation if disturbed, and we adjusted our path around it. Isolde spotted a shift in the terrain that suggested unstable ground, saving us from what might have been a dangerous fall. Torin's strength cleared obstacles that would have slowed us significantly otherwise. Each of us contributed in our own way, and for the first time since arriving on the vantage spire, I felt less like an outsider being tolerated and more like a genuine part of something whole. That feeling did not last. It happened as the light began to fade, the forest around us shifting into deep shadow as Cauldron's sun dipped below the distant ridgeline. We had stopped briefly to rest and check our position when Vex went suddenly still, his usual murmuring cutting off mid-sentence. Something is watching us, he said quietly. Torin's head snapped up, nostrils flaring as he scanned the tree line. Isolde rose slowly from where she had been kneeling, her hand drifting toward the blade at her side. I felt it too, a prickling awareness at the back of my neck, the kind of instinct that had kept creatures alive for longer than any of us had existed as species. How many? Isolde asked quietly. I cannot tell, Vex said. The signal is faint, deliberately faint. We moved closer together without needing to discuss it, forming a loose circle, backs nearly touching, eyes scanning the darkening forest in every direction. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the distant call of unfamiliar creatures, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze that suddenly felt far too quiet. Then the forest exploded into motion. They came from 3 directions at once, moving with a speed and precision that told me immediately this was no accident of nature. Severin hunters, the same species as Draeth, though these bore none of his restraint or discipline. Their amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, their movements fluid and terrifyingly efficient as they closed the distance between us in seconds. This was not part of the training scenario. This was real, and it was happening far faster than any of us had prepared for. Torin met the first attacker head-on, claws meeting claws in a clash that sent both of them tumbling into the underbrush. Isolde moved with practiced precision, using the terrain to avoid a second hunter's charge while searching for an opening. Vex, less suited to direct conflict, fell back, trying to coordinate our response even as fear crept into his voice over the comm. I found myself facing the third hunter alone. It was larger than Draeth, its hide marked with scars from what must have been countless previous hunts, its amber eyes fixed on me with an intensity that stripped away every ounce of confidence I had built over the past weeks. For a moment, pure animal fear threatened to freeze me in place. Then training took over, and instinct guided my hands toward the only advantage I had left. Not strength, not claws, my mind. I did not run in a straight line, which would have given the hunter every advantage its speed provided. Instead, I moved erratically, using fallen trees and dense brush to break its line of sight, forcing it to track me by scent and sound rather than direct pursuit. I remembered something from my studies of Severin biology, a detail most recruits dismissed as unimportant. Their exceptional hearing came paired with a vulnerability to sudden sharp sounds at close range, a natural defense mechanism most predators on their homeworld had evolved to avoid triggering in each other. I grabbed 2 pieces of loose metal from my pack, remnants of a broken tool, and waited until the hunter closed the distance, moving in for what would have been a decisive strike. At the last possible moment, I struck the metal pieces together with as much force as I could manage, producing a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the trees. The hunter recoiled, momentarily disoriented, giving me just enough time to scramble backward and put distance between us. It was not a solution. It was a delay, bought at the cost of nearly every advantage I had, but it was enough to buy time for Torin, freed from his own struggle, to intervene, driving the wounded hunter back with a ferocity that finally forced it to retreat into the darkness. The battle, if it could even be called that, ended almost as quickly as it began, the remaining hunters melting back into the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. We stood in the aftermath, breathing hard, checking each other for injuries. Torin bore several deep scratches along his arm. Isolde had a shallow cut across her cheek. Vex, though physically unharmed, looked shaken in a way that spoke to how close we had all come to disaster. That was not standard wildlife behavior, Isolde said, her voice tight with controlled tension. That was coordinated, deliberate. They were hunting us specifically, Torin agreed, his earlier confidence replaced by something more sober. Not testing us, hunting. I said nothing, though privately I agreed completely. This did not feel like a training exercise gone slightly wrong. It felt like something far older, a tradition Draeth had mentioned only in passing, one that predated the Confederacy entirely. His people did not simply train on Cauldron. They hunted here, and somehow, whether by accident or design, we had become part of that hunt. We continued moving through the night, exhausted but unwilling to stop long enough to become an easy target. Vex managed to re-establish a thin connection with the station, relaying our situation, though the response we received offered little comfort. Extraction could not be moved up. We were on our own until the scheduled pickup, regardless of the danger we now faced. By the time dawn began to break, casting pale light through the canopy above, exhaustion had settled deep into all of us. We found a defensible position among a cluster of large stones and agreed to rest in shifts, though sleep came reluctantly, if at all, with the memory of amber eyes still fresh in our minds. It was during my watch, with the others resting nearby, that I heard it again. That same prickling awareness, the sense of being watched by something patient and deliberate. I rose slowly, scanning the tree line, my hand resting on the hilt of my blade, though I knew, deep down, it would offer little real protection against what waited out there. A figure emerged from the shadows, and my breath caught in my throat. It was the same hunter from the night before, the one I had driven back with nothing more than 2 pieces of scrap metal and a desperate gamble. It moved slowly now, deliberately, its amber eyes locked on mine with an intensity that felt different from the raw aggression of our first encounter. This was something closer to curiosity, or perhaps calculation, as if it were trying to understand something about me that its instincts could not fully explain. I did not wake the others. Some instinct, deeper than fear, told me this moment was meant for me alone. "You came back," I said quietly, though I had no reason to believe it could understand me any more than I could understand whatever language it used among its own kind. The hunter tilted its head, studying me in silence, and for a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it let out a low sound, somewhere between a growl and something almost thoughtful, before turning and disappearing back into the forest as silently as it had arrived. I stood there long after it vanished, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It would not be our last encounter. Something told me, deep in the pit of my stomach, that the true test still waited ahead of us, somewhere between our current position and the extraction point still many hours away. And when it came, I suspected it would demand far more from me than a clever trick with scrap metal and a well-timed sound. We resumed our journey as soon as full daylight returned, moving with renewed caution through terrain that grew steadily more difficult. The forest gave way gradually to rockier ground, ridges rising sharply around us, forcing us to climb where we once could walk freely. Progress slowed, and with it, tension increased, each of us aware that every hour spent in the open was another hour of vulnerability. It was nearing midday when Vex's tracking abilities picked up something ahead, a signal far stronger and more deliberate than anything we had encountered the night before. "There is something waiting for us," he said, voice tight with barely controlled fear, directly along our planned route. "We could divert," Isolde suggested, already calculating alternate paths. "There is no time," Torin countered. "Any diversion risks missing the extraction window entirely." I studied the terrain ahead, a natural choke point formed by two steep ridges converging into a narrow pass, the only reasonable route toward our extraction point within our remaining time. It was, I realized with a sinking feeling, the perfect location for an ambush, a place where numbers and terrain would favor whatever waited for us far more than they favored our small, exhausted squad. "We go through," I said finally. "Together. No one gets separated, no matter what happens." The others exchanged glances, but none of them argued. We had come too far, faced too much together, to consider any other option now. We moved toward the pass as one unit, weapons ready, senses straining for any sign of what waited ahead, unaware that within that narrow stretch of stone and shadow waited not simply another hunter testing our resolve, but the very alpha of the pack that had marked us as prey the moment we set foot on Cauldron's surface. What happened next inside that pass would test everything I had learned since stepping off that airlock weeks earlier, and it would force me to make a choice that no amount of training, no simulation, and no lesson from a trainer as legendary as Draith Vornkesh could have fully prepared me for. The pass narrowed as we entered, stone walls rising steep on either side, blocking out much of the midday light and casting long shadows across the uneven ground. Every sound seemed magnified in that confined space. Our footsteps, our breathing, the distant call of unseen creatures echoing off rock that had likely witnessed countless hunts long before Squad 7 ever set foot on this world. Torin led the way, muscles tense beneath his plated hide, every sense alert for the first sign of danger. Isolde moved close behind, her usual calm replaced by a sharpness that told me she felt the same weight I did, the sense that we were walking directly into something far larger than a simple ambush. Vex stayed near the center of our group, murmuring calculations under his breath, though I noticed his voice had begun to shake slightly, the strain of the past day finally catching up with him. We were perhaps halfway through the pass when the Alpha revealed itself. It stepped out from behind a jagged outcropping ahead of us, and immediately I understood why every hunter we had encountered so far seemed almost hesitant compared to this creature. It was larger than any Severin I had seen, its hide marked with scars that told a story of countless victories, its amber eyes carrying a weight of intelligence and authority that made the earlier hunters seem like mere shadows in comparison. This was not simply another predator testing recruits. This was the one who had likely trained every hunter we had faced, the true master of Cauldron's ancient hunting grounds. Torin froze mid-step, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear cross his features. Isolde's hand trembled slightly where it rested near her blade. Vex made a small, involuntary sound, backing instinctively toward the rest of us. The Alpha did not attack immediately. Instead, it studied us, its gaze moving deliberately across each member of our squad before settling, finally, on me. "It remembers you," Isolde whispered, barely audible. I did not move, did not break eye contact, though every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything other than stand my ground before something so clearly capable of ending my life in an instant. But running, I understood with sudden clarity, would accomplish nothing except confirming every doubt anyone had ever held about whether I belonged in this program, on this mission, among species built for exactly this kind of danger. The Alpha took a slow step forward, and Torin moved instinctively to place himself between the creature and the rest of us, a gesture of protection that surprised me given how our relationship had begun weeks earlier. "No," I said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. "This is not meant for you." "Lena," he said, using my name for the first time since we had met, his voice carrying a warning I understood completely. "You cannot face this alone." "I have to," I said, and stepped forward before he could argue further. The Alpha watched me approach, its massive frame utterly still, amber eyes tracking my every movement with the patience of a creature that had never once needed to rush toward victory. I stopped a careful distance away, close enough to show I would not flee, far enough to maintain whatever small advantage distance might offer. "I don't know what you want from me," I said, my voice steadier than I expected given how hard my heart was pounding. "But my squad is not leaving this pass without me, and I am not leaving without them." The Alpha tilted its head, the same gesture I had witnessed from the hunter the night before, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then, without warning, it lunged. I threw myself sideways, rolling across the rocky ground as claws swept through the space I had occupied a heartbeat earlier. Behind me, I heard Torin shout my name, heard the sound of Isolde moving to intervene, but I called out sharply for them to stay back, understanding somehow, on some instinctive level, that this confrontation needed to remain between the Alpha and myself alone, that any interference might cost far more than it could possibly help. The fight that followed was unlike anything I had trained for. I could not match the Alpha's strength, could not hope to overpower it through force or speed. Every advantage belonged to the creature stalking me across that narrow pass. Every disadvantage belonged to me. And yet, I refused to fall. I used the terrain the way I had learned to during our earlier encounter, ducking behind outcroppings of stone, using narrow gaps too small for the Alpha's larger frame to fully exploit, forcing it to work for every inch of ground it gained. I remembered the vulnerability I had exploited before, the sensitivity to sudden sharp sound, and though I no longer had the scrap metal that had saved me the first time, I found other tools within reach, striking stones together, shouting when the moment called for it, anything to disrupt the Alpha's focus and buy myself precious seconds. It was not enough to win. I understood that clearly, even as I fought. The Alpha was simply too strong, too fast, too experienced for someone like me to defeat through skill or cleverness alone. Eventually, exhaustion began to win the battle that raw strength alone could not, my movements growing slower, my reactions delayed by fatigue that had been building since the moment we landed on this world. The Alpha caught me finally, a powerful blow that sent me sprawling across the stone ground, my vision swimming, pain radiating through my side where I had struck the rocky surface. I struggled to rise, knowing on some level that I likely would not succeed, that this might genuinely be the end of everything I had fought so hard to prove. The Alpha approached slowly, towering over me, amber eyes studying my battered form with an expression I could not fully interpret. Behind it, I could hear Torin's desperate voice, hear the sound of Isolde and Vex moving forward despite my earlier warning, unwilling to simply watch me face this alone any longer. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain screaming through my body, and forced myself to stand between the approaching Alpha and my squad, who had rushed forward despite everything, refusing to abandon me even when logic and survival instinct told them to stay back. It was, I realized in that moment, exactly the same choice I had made for Torin during our simulation weeks earlier, now reflected back at me by the very squadmates who had once mocked my presence among them. "Stay behind me," I said, my voice hoarse but steady, refusing to let fear or exhaustion break the resolve that had carried me this far. The Alpha stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. The great predator stood before me, close enough that I could feel the heat of its breath, close enough that a single swipe of its claws would have ended everything instantly. And yet, it did not strike. It simply watched, its amber eyes moving from me, to Torin standing protectively beside me, to Isolde and Vex closing ranks around us both, forming a united front despite every disadvantage stacked against us. Something shifted in the Alpha's expression, something I had not expected to see in a creature built entirely for hunting and dominance. It was not fear, and it was not simple curiosity anymore. It looked, impossibly, like recognition. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha lowered its massive head. I did not understand at first what I was witnessing. Torin, beside me, let out a sound of pure astonishment, his earlier fear replaced entirely by something closer to reverence. Isolde stood frozen, her calculating mind clearly struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. Vex simply stared, silent, for the first time since our encounter began. The Alpha, the undisputed master of Cauldron's ancient hunting grounds, continued lowering itself, front legs bending, massive frame settling toward the stone ground in a gesture that could only be described as submission. It was kneeling. Not out of fear, I understood slowly, watching this impossible scene unfold before me. Not because I had defeated it through strength or skill, because I clearly had not. It knelt because of something else entirely, something ancient within its own species that recognized a will refusing to break, a spirit that stood its ground not through power, but through pure, unshakable resolve, choosing to protect others even when every logical calculation suggested doing so was hopeless. I later learned, through Draith himself, that among the Severin, submission was never given easily, and never given out of fear. It was earned only by those who proved, beyond any doubt, that they would not break, regardless of the odds stacked against them. In thousands of years of hunts conducted on Cauldron's unforgiving surface, the Alpha had never once encountered a creature willing to stand between it and others without any hope of victory through strength alone. It had encountered many warriors. It had never encountered someone like me. The moment stretched on, silent and surreal, until finally, the Alpha rose again, its amber eyes holding mine for one final, weighted moment, before it turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the pass, leaving us alone in stunned, exhausted silence. None of us spoke for a long time afterward. Torin finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a reverence I had never heard from him before. "In all my life," he said quietly, "I have never witnessed anything like what just happened." "Neither have I," Isolde admitted, her usual composure fully returned, though something in her tone suggested the experience had changed her understanding of the world in ways she was still processing. Vex simply reached out, resting a hand briefly on my shoulder, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words could have offered. We continued through the pass in silence after that, no further hunters emerging to challenge us, as if word of what had happened had somehow already spread among the creatures of that ancient hunting ground. We reached the extraction point with hours to spare, exhausted, injured, but alive, and utterly changed by everything we had witnessed and endured together. What none of us knew yet was that the entire encounter had not gone unwitnessed by the wider Confederacy. High above Cauldron's surface, hidden observation systems built into the training protocol had captured everything, every moment of the confrontation, every impossible choice I had made, and every reaction from a species that had never before, in recorded history, been seen kneeling before anything. That footage was already being reviewed by officers throughout the Vantage Spire, including one figure in particular who had watched my journey from the very beginning with a mixture of skepticism and growing curiosity. Draith Vornkesh sat alone in his private quarters, replaying the recording of what had happened in that narrow stone pass, watching again and again as the mightiest hunter his own species had ever produced lowered itself before a creature he had once dismissed as too soft, too fragile, too unsuited for the life we had all chosen to pursue among the stars. Something in his understanding of strength, of worthiness, of what it truly meant to belong among the Confederacy's finest, had shifted permanently that day. And when Squad 7 finally returned to the Vantage Spire, exhausted but triumphant, he would be waiting for us, ready to acknowledge something he had never expected to acknowledge in all his years as a trainer of recruits from across the known galaxy. The transport ride back to the vantage spire passed mostly in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, still processing everything that had happened within that narrow stone pass. My body ached in places I had not known could ache, bruises forming along my ribs where I had struck the ground, exhaustion settling deep into muscles that had given everything they had to give during those final desperate moments. Yet beneath the pain, something else had taken root, a quiet, steady confidence that no amount of mockery or doubt could easily shake loose again. Torrin sat across from me for most of the journey, occasionally glancing my way as if still trying to fully process what he had witnessed. Isolde remained composed as always, though I noticed her studying me with a new kind of attention, less clinical than before, more genuinely curious about the person behind the choices I had made. Vex, finally reconnected fully with his hive once we came within range of the station, seemed lighter somehow, though he still turned occasionally to look at me with an expression I had come to recognize as quiet gratitude. When the transport finally docked, the doors opening onto the familiar corridors of the vantage spire, I expected exhaustion to overwhelm whatever reception awaited us. Instead, I found the corridor near our arrival bay crowded with recruits from other squads, word of what had happened on Caldron having apparently spread well ahead of our return. The reception was nothing like my arrival weeks earlier. Recruits who had once laughed openly at my presence now watched with expressions ranging from disbelief to genuine respect. Some stepped forward to offer quiet words of acknowledgement as we passed, gestures I had not expected and did not fully know how to receive after everything I had endured to reach this moment. Even Ryza, the Krail commander in training, who had made her contempt for my presence so clear from the beginning, stood near the edge of the crowd, her expression unreadable, though notably absent was the open hostility she had shown me before. We made our way toward the medical bay to have our injuries treated, and it was there, resting on a treatment table while a medical officer tended to the bruising along my ribs, that Draith Vornkesh finally appeared. He entered the room quietly, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone inside, despite his lack of any dramatic gesture. The medical officer stepped back respectfully, and for a long moment, Draith simply stood beside my table, studying me with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something far removed from the cold assessment that had greeted me on my very first day. "I have reviewed the recordings from Cauldron," he said finally. "I assumed there would be recordings," I replied, my voice still hoarse from exhaustion. "What you did in that pass," he continued, "should not have been possible. Not because you lacked skill, though your skill exceeded every expectation I held for you when you first arrived. It should not have been possible because what you demonstrated is something my people have hunted for, longed for, and rarely if ever found in all our years of testing recruits from across the Confederacy." "I didn't do anything special," I said. "I just refused to leave them behind." "That," Draith said, "is precisely the point you continue to misunderstand about yourself, Recruit Cole. Among my people, strength is measured in claws, in speed, in the raw power to dominate whatever stands before us. We have built our entire understanding of worth around that measurement for longer than your species has existed as a civilization capable of reaching the stars. And yet, in all that time, in all those centuries of hunts and trials and tests designed to separate the strong from the weak, we have never once witnessed what you demonstrated in that pass. A will that does not break, not because it lacks fear, but because something within it values others more than its own survival." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply remained quiet, letting his words settle over me in the aftermath of everything I had endured. "The Alpha you faced," Draith continued, "has hunted on Cauldron for longer than any Severin currently living. It has faced warriors from 100 different worlds, has tested the resolve of recruits far stronger, far more naturally suited to combat than you could ever claim to be. Not one of them earned what you earned in that pass. Not one of them witnessed what my recorded footage now shows the entire Confederacy leadership." He paused, and something in his posture shifted, a change so subtle I almost missed it entirely. Then, in front of the medical officer, in front of several recruits who had gathered near the doorway drawn by curiosity about what was unfolding. Draith Vorn Kesh knelt. It was not a gesture I had ever witnessed him perform, not for any commanding officer, not for any senior member of the Confederacy leadership during the brief time such figures had visited the station. It was, I would later learn, an ancient rite among his people, reserved only for those who had earned genuine respect through demonstrated worth, a gesture so rarely given that most Severin lived entire lifetimes without ever witnessing it performed. "I misjudged you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "I placed you in Squad 7 believing you would fail quietly, sparing the program the embarrassment of a human recruit unsuited for the challenges we present here. I was wrong, and I acknowledge that error now, before witnesses, as is proper among my people when such an error has been made." I sat there, stunned into silence, watching one of the most respected trainers in the entire Confederacy kneeling before me, a gesture that would have seemed impossible to imagine just weeks earlier when I first stepped off that airlock into a hall full of mocking laughter. "You may rise," I said finally, unsure of what else to say in a moment that felt far beyond anything I had prepared for. Draithith rose slowly, and for the first time since I had known him, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the edges of his expression. "Squad 7 will no longer carry that designation," he said. "Effective immediately, your squad will be recognized among the top training units on this station, and you, Recruit Cole, will be considered for advanced instruction, reserved for those who demonstrate exceptional capability." The following weeks brought changes I could never have anticipated during those difficult early days. Recruits who once mocked me openly now sought me out for advice, curious about the mindset that had allowed me to face something as fearsome as Cauldron's Alpha and emerge, if not victorious in the traditional sense, then victorious in a way that mattered far more deeply. Torin became something closer to a genuine friend than I had ever expected possible. Our earlier rivalry transformed into a bond built on mutual respect and shared experience. Isolde, still precise and calculating in most things, began treating our friendship with the same careful attention she gave everything else she valued, which I came to understand was, in its own way, a profound compliment. Vex, finally comfortable enough within the squad to speak more freely even when disconnected from his hive, became someone I genuinely looked forward to seeing each day. Ryza approached me only once more during those following weeks, cornering me near the training deck much as she had before. I braced myself for renewed hostility, but instead, she simply studied me for a long moment before speaking. "I was wrong about you," she said, the words clearly costing her some effort to admit. "I do not fully understand what happened on Cauldron, and I am not certain I ever will. But I recognize now that whatever measure I used to judge your worth was incomplete. It was not a full apology, not exactly, but it was something, and I accepted it as such, understanding that growth sometimes arrives in smaller steps than we might hope for." News of what happened on Cauldron did not remain contained to the Vantage Spire alone. Within weeks, word had spread throughout other Confederacy training stations, carried by officers and recruits who had reviewed the footage or heard second-hand accounts of a human recruit who had earned the submission of an apex predator through nothing more than sheer, unbreakable will. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration, unwilling to believe such a thing possible from a species so often dismissed as fragile and unsuited for the harsh realities of life among the stars. Others, particularly those who had access to the original recordings, understood exactly how significant that moment truly was. I received messages from recruits I had never met, stationed on distant training worlds across Confederacy space, asking questions about how I had managed what I did, whether humanity as a whole shared whatever quality had allowed me to stand my ground against something so clearly beyond my physical capabilities. I did not have perfect answers for them, only the truth as I understood it, that strength came in many forms, and that the willingness to stand for others, even when every calculation suggested doing so was hopeless, might be a kind of strength the wider galaxy had simply never learned to properly measure. Draith, in the months that followed, became something closer to a mentor than a trainer, taking a personal interest in my continued development that surprised everyone who remembered his cold dismissal of me during those early days. He never fully explained what had changed within him during that period, though I suspected it went deeper than simply witnessing my confrontation with the Alpha. I believe, in his own way, watching that moment had forced him to reconsider assumptions about strength and worth that his entire species had carried for generations, assumptions that had perhaps limited their own understanding of what true resilience could look like. Late one evening, months after our return from Cauldron, I found myself standing alone near one of the station's observation windows, looking out at the vast expanse of stars stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Draith joined me quietly, standing beside me in comfortable silence for several long moments before speaking. "Word continues to spread," he said finally. "Other species within the Confederacy are beginning to ask questions about humanity that they never considered relevant before. What other qualities might your species possess that we have failed to properly recognize? What might happen if the galaxy stops underestimating creatures like you? And what do you think will happen?" I asked, watching the distant stars twinkle against the endless dark. Draith was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything since that day in the past. "I believe," he said finally, "that we are only beginning to understand what your kind is truly capable of. And I believe, Recruit Cole, that the galaxy would be wise to pay very close attention to what comes next." I thought about Squad 7, about Torin and Isolde and Vex, about the mockery I had endured during those first difficult weeks, and the respect that had slowly, painfully, been earned in its place. I thought about the Alpha kneeling before me in that stone pass, about Draith kneeling before me in that medical bay, about every doubt I had carried onto this station, and every one I had proven wrong through nothing more than refusing to break when everything told me I should. Somewhere across the vast Confederacy, other humans were likely facing their own versions of the doubt and dismissal I had encountered, their own versions of squads built from rejects and afterthoughts, their own moments waiting ahead where everything they had ever been told about their limitations would be tested against realities far more demanding than anyone had prepared them for. I did not know exactly what waited for humanity across the wider galaxy in the years to come, but standing there beside Draith, looking out at those endless stars, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever the Confederacy, and whatever species scattered across it, had once believed about humans being too soft, too fragile, too unsuited for the challenges of life among the stars, that understanding was about to change, one recruit, one squad, one impossible moment of unbreakable will at a time. And somewhere far beyond the vantage spire, across a galaxy that had spent generations underestimating a species it barely understood, that change was only just beginning.